Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we'll be looking at this educational resource, and it's all about light and shadows.
Oh, cool.
It's actually a JavaScript virtual lab simulation that's designed for primary school students in Singapore.
Okay.
So, on the surface, this topic might seem really simple,
hmm
but I think as we dig into it, you'll see that there's actually a lot more to it than you might think.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. This deep dive is definitely going to shed some light on some of the, really interesting aspects of light and shadows.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me how you can use a virtual environment like this
Yeah.
to really bring to life something that's so fundamental.
Right.
The resource that we're looking at today simulates how shadows are formed using dotted white lines to represent light. And the idea is that, really highlights this idea of light traveling in straight paths.
Yeah, for sure. Those dotted lines are a really neat way to show that kind of crucial principle, right? And then they take it even further by letting the students actually manipulate the light source in the simulation. A slit and different objects, and they can actually see how those straight light paths create shadows in real time.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So what kind of manipulations can the students actually do in this virtual lab?
Well, they can adjust the light source's position, like up, down, left, right, that kind of thing.
Okay.
They can change how intense the light is. They can even change the color of the light.
Wow.
And then they can also change the size of the slit and which way it's facing, vertical, horizontal. Like, of course, they can pick what they want to cast a shadow, like a ball or a block or
Oh, I see.
whatever shape, and move those around too.
So it's not just like observing, these preset scenarios.
Yeah.
They can actually experiment
Exactly.
with their own ideas about how this all works.
Yeah, it's really cool. It lets them, play around and test things out for themselves, which is really great for young learners.
Yeah, I bet that's really empowering for them.
Totally. And to connect it back to the real world, there's a hands-on activity where students use a torchlight to sort of mimic the sun's path throughout the day.
I see.
And they get to see firsthand how the angle of the light, changes the length of the shadows.
Yeah.
Just like how shadows are longest in the morning and evening and shortest at noon.
Oh, right. Because the sun is directly overhead then.
Exactly.
I can already see how this virtual lab kind of goes beyond just the basics. You know what I mean?
For sure.
But you mentioned earlier that there are some aha moments, some counterintuitive concepts that students might come across.
Yeah.
Are there any examples of that?
Yeah. So one of the most surprising things is that moving the light source further away from the object actually makes the shadow bigger.
Wait, really?
Yeah. You'd think that a dimmer light would make a smaller shadow, but that's not always how it works.
So why does that happen?
Well, it has to do with how light rays spread out as they travel. Imagine them like a fan coming out from the source.
Okay.
The further that the light travels, the wider that fan gets.
Uh-huh.
So when the light source is further away, that spread of light covers more area behind the object, making a bigger shadow.
Wow. Okay. I'm starting to see how this deep dive is going to make me rethink some of my assumptions about light and shadows. I'm really curious to hear more about this slit, though.
Oh, yeah.
It sounds like it adds another layer of complexity.
Yeah, definitely. So imagine a thin rectangular opening, right?
Okay.
That's your slit. And you can change how big it is, but also which way it's facing, up and down, sideways, or at an angle.
So by turning the slit, you're changing the shape of the light beam coming through.
Yeah.
And would that change the shape of the shadow, too?
Exactly. It's a small change, but it makes a big difference in the shadow's shape.
Wow.
Think of it like this. If you shine a flashlight through a narrow vertical slit, you get this long, thin beam of light.
Right.
But turn that slit sideways, and suddenly the beam is wide and short.
Okay, so it's like turning a spotlight into a floodlight just by changing the slit.
Yeah, exactly.
Are there any real-world examples of this kind of thing?
Oh, tons. Think about stage lighting in a theater.
Oh,
They use different lenses and shutters to shape the light and create cool effects with shadows.
that's so cool how a principle we're talking about here in a virtual lab for elementary school students
Right.
can be used in professional stage productions.
It's all connected. The fundamentals of light and shadow are everywhere,
Yeah.
The way sunlight filters through leaves on a tree, or how architects design buildings to have cool shadows.
It's not just about science, it's about seeing the world in a new way.
Exactly. And this virtual lab encourages students to look beyond what they see at first glance and really discover how amazing and complex something as simple as a shadow can be.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
You said the lab can identify incorrectly modeled lighted parts.
Oh, yeah, that's a really neat feature.
What does that mean?
So, like if a student tries to light up an object in the lab without a light source present, the system will flag it as an error, because you can't just have light without a
Right.
source.
It's like a built-in reality check.
Exactly. It makes sure the students are really understanding the principles of light and shadow.
That's a great way to instill scientific rigor even in young kids.
Yeah, for sure.
This lab seems to really strike a good balance between letting them explore and play
Yeah,
and making sure they're learning sound science.
it's definitely a strength of the program.
Yeah.
It's also interesting to note that this was made specifically for schools in Singapore,
Oh, really?
which shows how technology can be tailored to different cultures and learners.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
It's not just about giving information, it's about making it engaging and relevant to the people using it.
exactly.
But before we get into the teaching side of things, I want to hear more about this shadow puppetry connection
Oh, right.
you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, shadow puppetry is a really cool way to show how light and shadow can be used creatively.
Mm-hmm.
The virtual lab actually has questions that get students thinking about the history of shadow puppets, how they're made, and how they move.
Oh, wow. So it goes beyond just the science
Yeah.
and into art and culture.
Absolutely. It's all connected,
Yeah.
And it just shows how something as simple as a shadow can open up a whole world of learning and exploration.
I love that. It's like turning a science lesson into a storytelling adventure.
Exactly. It makes learning fun and exciting.
This is already so interesting. We've covered a lot of ground here, from light traveling in straight lines to how shadow size can change, and even this connection to shadow puppetry.
Yeah, it's been a good start, and there's still so much more to discover about this virtual lab.
Well, I'm definitely ready to dig deeper.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is amazing how, something so basic can lead to so many different ideas. But before we go too far down the shadow puppet rabbit hole,
Right.
let's maybe come back to the virtual lab for a minute.
Yeah. Good idea. We've covered a lot already.
Yeah.
What do you think are some of the biggest strengths of this lab as a teaching tool?
I think one of the coolest things is how it really encourages kids to be curious and to experiment.
Mm.
They're not just, sitting there being told stuff.
Uh-huh.
They're actually changing things around, seeing what happens, and then figuring out why based on their own observations.
So they're like little scientists testing out their hypotheses about light and shadows.
Exactly. And that's a really powerful way to learn. When you're actually involved in figuring things out, it sticks with you so much better.
I bet it helps them develop critical thinking skills too.
Oh, totally. They're not just taking things at face value. They're questioning things, trying things out, and adjusting their understanding based on what they see.
Right. It's like real science.
It is. This lab is a perfect example of how to move away from just memorizing facts and towards really understanding the concepts behind them.
And it manages to do that while still being fun and engaging for younger kids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's not easy to find that balance, but this lab does it really well.
Mm.
It uses visuals and hands-on controls and connections to the real world to make learning both enjoyable and effective.
Speaking of real-world connections, can we go back to that hands-on activity with the torchlight for a minute?
Oh, yeah.
I'm curious about how that takes the learning outside of the virtual world.
It's a really clever way to reinforce the stuff they learned in the lab.
Okay.
So picture this. You've got a student holding a torch, and that's like the sun.
Yeah.
And they shine it on something. As they move the sun, they see how the shadow changes throughout the day.
Oh, so it's like they're recreating the movement of the sun and its effect on shadows.
Exactly. They see that when the sun is low, the shadows are long and stretched out.
Uh-huh.
But as the sun gets higher, the shadows get shorter.
I bet it's really cool for them to see that connection play out right in front of them.
Yeah, it makes something abstract, like light and shadow, feel much more real and concrete.
Right. It brings it into their world.
Exactly. And it shows them that science isn't just something you learn in a book, it's all around us.
I like that. It sounds like this virtual lab is a good example of how technology can actually support hands-on learning instead of replacing it.
Totally. Technology can be an amazing tool to get kids interested and make tough ideas easier to grasp. But it's important to balance that with real-world experiences and exploration.
Yeah, I agree with that. Earlier, you mentioned that this lab was specifically designed for use in Singaporean schools.
Right.
What do you think is the impact of tailoring educational resources to specific cultures like that?
I think it can make a huge difference when students see their own culture reflected in what they're learning.
Yeah,
It makes it feel more relevant and interesting.
like it matters to them.
Exactly. It's like the difference between reading about a place and actually going there.
Right, it becomes personal.
And when students feel connected to the material like that, they're way more likely to want to learn it and remember it
So by bringing in elements of Singaporean culture, this lab is not only teaching good science,
Right.
but it's also being culturally sensitive.
Exactly. And that's super important these days.
Hmm.
We need to make sure that all students feel seen and valued no matter what their background is.
I'm curious what specific parts of Singaporean culture are included in the lab.
Well, for one thing, it probably aligns with the learning goals and standards that are already part of the Singaporean science curriculum.
Oh, okay.
So it's not just a random bunch of experiments. It
Right.
actually fits in with what they're already supposed to be learning.
That makes sense. It ensures that what they're learning in the lab is actually useful and meaningful to them.
Exactly. But it goes beyond just the curriculum, too. For example, that hands-on activity with the torchlight might talk about landmarks or places in Singapore.
Oh, I see.
Instead of just saying object, they might say something like, imagine the Merlion statue casting a shadow.
That's a good example. It grounds the science in their own experience.
Right. It's not just an abstract idea anymore. It's something they can actually picture and relate to.
So it's like we were saying before, it's about making the learning personal.
Exactly. And by doing that, the lab creates a learning environment that's both inclusive and culturally relevant.
It's a good reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to education.
Yeah.
We need to think about the specific needs and backgrounds of our students.
Absolutely. And this virtual lab seems to be doing a great job of that.
I think so too. It shows how far we've come in terms of educational tools.
Yeah.
Remember when learning about light and shadow just meant looking at diagrams in a textbook
Oh, yeah.
and maybe doing some basic experiments?
Right.
But now we have these amazing virtual labs
Yeah.
where students can actually change things around, see the results instantly, and get feedback.
It's pretty amazing how technology is changing education, isn't it?
It is. It's making it more engaging and accessible and personalized.
And this lab is a perfect example of how to do that, right?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
combines solid science
Hmm.
with innovative teaching methods.
I agree. It's really impressive, but it's not just about the technology itself.
Oh, right, of course.
It's about how it's used.
Yeah, the thinking behind it.
Exactly. The activities, the questions that make them think critically, and how it connects science with other things like art and culture.
It's like the lab provides the space, but it's the teacher and the students who really bring it to life.
I like that analogy. It's a partnership.
I think it's also worth mentioning that feature that checks for incorrectly lit objects again.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
It really stresses the importance of getting the science right.
Even in a virtual world.
Yeah, exactly. It helps them understand that you can't just have light without a source.
It's all about cause and effect.
It shows how carefully this lab was designed.
For sure. They really put a lot of thought into making it both fun and scientifically accurate.
And I love how it includes stuff about shadow puppetry.
Oh, yeah, me too.
It's such a cool way to connect science, art, and culture.
Shadow puppetry is an ancient art form.
Yeah. How do they actually encourage the students to explore that part of the lab?
Well, like we talked about earlier, they have questions that guide them to learn about the history of shadow puppetry and how it's done. They might research different traditions from around the world or learn about how the puppets are made, or even try making their own and putting on a show.
That's so cool. It takes the learning to a whole other level.
Right. It's not just about the facts anymore. It's about experiencing light and shadow through art and creativity.
It's like a science lesson, an art history lesson, and a cultural exploration all rolled into one.
Exactly. And that kind of learning is so much richer and more meaningful for students.
I'm starting to think we should try our hand at shadow puppetry after this.
Maybe we should. But seriously, I think this whole deep dive has shown us something important about learning.
What's that?
It's shown us that even the simplest things can be full of surprises and learning opportunities.
Yeah?
We don't need fancy equipment or complicated theories to get curious and excited about the world.
Right.
Sometimes all it takes is a shadow, a light, and a willingness to ask questions.
That's a great takeaway.
Yeah.
It reminds me that science is everywhere, not just in a lab.
Exactly. It's a way of looking at the world.
Yeah, a way of understanding and appreciating everything around us.
And that's something that's open to everyone, no matter who they are or where they come from.
As long as they're curious.
Exactly. Curiosity is the key.
Yeah, it really is amazing how something so ordinary can be so fascinating when you really start to think about it.
It's all about perspective, right?
Exactly.
Hmm.
We've talked about the science and the art, but what about the teaching side of things?
Right.
What makes this kind of interactive learning so effective?
Well, one of the big things is that it lets kids learn at their own pace.
No.
They can go back to stuff they need more help with or spend extra time on things they're really into.
So it's like everyone gets their own learning plan based on what they need.
Exactly. It's way more flexible than trying to teach everyone the same thing at the same time.
Right, because everyone learns differently.
Exactly. And another good thing is that it gets them actively involved.
Okay.
Instead of just listening or reading, they're doing stuff, trying things out, seeing what happens.
I bet that makes it more fun for them.
Oh, definitely. And when they're having fun, they learn better too.
It's like learning by doing.
Exactly. And you remember things better when you've actually done them yourself.
This lab really is a good example of moving away from that old school way of teaching,
Yeah.
where you just sit and listen.
It's all about active learning now. And technology can really help with that.
It really can. This has been such an interesting deep dive.
Yeah.
We've learned so much about light and shadows
Yeah.
and seen how this cool virtual lab is changing the way kids learn.
It's been a good reminder that even something as simple as a shadow can teach us a lot.
It really has.
Mm.
Before we finish up, though, I
Yeah.
want to leave our listeners with a little challenge.
I like a good challenge.
Mm-hmm.
What do you have in mind?
Well, we've talked a lot about how the position of the light changes the shadow.
Right.
But what about the shape of the light itself?
Well, yeah.
Have you ever noticed how, like, a street light with a fancy design
Uh-huh.
or a lamp with a cool pattern on it
Yeah.
can make really interesting shadows?
Yeah, sometimes you see those and you're like, wow, I wonder what made that.
Exactly. So here's the challenge. I want everyone listening to pay attention to the shadows around them.
Okay.
See if you can find any shadows with unusual shapes and try to guess what kind of light made them.
That's a fun idea.
It's a good way to use what we've learned today
Yeah.
and to start seeing light and shadow in a whole new way.
It's like a little scavenger hunt for shadows.
Exactly. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the amazing world of light and shadow.
It's been a pleasure exploring this with you.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep looking for those fascinating shadows all around you.